Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rodette Ferrer. In this presentation, I will be summarizing and highlighting some key points from Yalom Chapter 7 about transference and transparency. Sigmund Freud first described the concept of transference in his 1895 book called The Studies on Hysteria. He talks about noticing the deep, intense, and often unconscious feelings that develop sometimes in the therapeutic relationship that was established in those clients he was treating. Transference occurs when the client unconsciously transfers his or her emotions towards the therapist. Freud stated that transference usually is related to unresolved issues that has occurred in the client's past. He also realized that transference, if used properly, could be an effective tool for therapists. There are different ways clients communicate with transference when in a therapeutic relationship. The first method can be when the client communicates their feelings directly with the therapist. Usually in this case, the client realizes what is occurring.
8 days until our due date.
The next method of transference seen is called symbolic.
6 days
In this
until our
method, the
due
client communicates transference
date. A
through
couple of hours.
their experiences or stories. These stories or experiences can resemble their perception of the relationship with the therapist. In this scenario, the client may or may not realize that transference is occurring. A next method of transference occurs through communication of dreams and fantasies experienced by the client. The client may have dreams or fantasies about the therapist, where the therapist is present, or if it's about the current relationship with the therapist.
Did you get your vaccine yet?
The client may or may not realize that this is occurring.
Did you get your vaccine yet?
The next method is called enactment. This is when the client takes on a particular role with the therapist. For example, a client may take the role of a child, treating the therapist as if the therapist is their mother. The client may expect the therapist to fulfill maternal needs that they were not given to as a child. Usually in this case, the client doesn't realize that transference is occurring. This slide talks about examples of destructive transference that can occur in specifically group settings or group therapy. The first type of destructive transference is idolizing the leader. So in this scenario, the group members overestimate, or an individual, overestimate the power and knowledge of the therapist. They view the therapist's words and they give it more weight and wisdom than they actually carry. So all the credit is given to the therapist. If there are any errors, faux pas, or absences that are seen in the sessions, Usually the client states that it's a technique that they're using to provoke the group for its own good. The next example of destructive transference is evaluating the leader. So in this scenario, the therapist is distrusted, misunderstood, and they are treated like an enemy. To clarify the leader, I'm referring to the therapist of the group sessions. So whether the group members or the individual is idealizing the leader or devaluing the leader, the therapist has to address any of these issues in order to move on with the therapy sessions. In order to maintain balance or avoid destructive transference, the therapist must be transparent and use some sort of self-disclosure. Using transparency and self-disclosure allows the maintenance of the therapeutic relationship with the clients. It balances the therapist in a position between the client's transference and its therapeutic disconfirmation. Transparency is important in a therapeutic relationship because it allows the client to see and understand the process of therapy. During this process, the therapist describes their model of therapy, theoretical assumptions that they use to guide their work, and how their clients change in and outside of the therapy room. It also allows the clients to clarify any their perception that the therapist may have of the problem, any hypothesis they may have, and the overall direction of the therapy. Self-disclosure can be a little controversial depending on the therapist. Yalom stated in his book that self-disclosure can be good during sessions because it can deepen the understanding for the mutual impact between the therapist and the group member. There are different types of self-disclosure. The first one is deliberate. This one, the therapist does consciously and intentionally. So this can be self-revealing or self-involving disclosures. The next one is unavoidable or non-deliberate. In this scenario, the client receives volume of information about the therapist before they actually start the sessions. Unavoidable, non-deliberate disclosures can also occur when the client sees the therapist's family pictures in the room, how they're dressed, what kind of car they drive, how they walk. Those are all unavoidable self-disclosures. An accidental self-disclosure can occur beyond the therapist's control. An example of accidental would be if the client runs into the therapist into the store and the therapist is with their family members and the family member is a member of the Senate or some political position, and so they automatically have this information that wasn't verbally given to the client. The next type of self-disclosure is the client's deliberate actions or client initiated. An example of this would be the client doing an internet search on the therapist, and all this information comes up about the therapist that he or she may not have chosen to divulge verbally. GoodCounselingConnection.com talks about another type of disclosure known as inappropriate disclosure. And they state that this is more for the benefit of the therapist rather than the client. This can happen through natural human tendencies, but can result in the client being burdened with information and feeling obligated to take care of the therapist's needs. So a good example would be the client finds out that the therapist has a death in the family, and so the client now feels obligated to ask the therapist how they're doing, how they're coping, and if they need anything, if there's anything they can do to help the therapist. Yalom discusses an objection to self-disclosure. He believes is the fear of escalation. And going into detail, he talks about the fear that once the therapist reveals themselves, the group will demand even more information. So in group therapy, transference will occur if the group therapist assumes responsibility of the leadership, if transference is not appreciated, the therapist will not fully understand the process of the group. Yalom states that therapists who do not acknowledge transference may misunderstand some of the transactions and confuse the group rather than guide them. However, Yalom also stated that therapists should not only focus on the transference aspects of the group because they might not authentically relate to the group members. Yalom also talks about group spirit, and group spirit is where the therapist treats everyone on an equal level. Freud states that in this scenario, the group members don't wish to be equal to the leader, but they only desire and demand equality when it comes to the other group members. In other words, according to Yalom, if no one can be the favorite, then there must be no favorite at all. So there are a couple ways to resolve transference distortions in the group. One is called consensual validation. This is the process where a therapist help a client check the accuracy of his or her perception or the results of his experience by comparing it with those of others in the group. The next one is increased therapist transparency. The therapist helps the client confirm or disconfirm their impression of the therapist. And they do this by gradually revealing more of themselves. So the takeaway of this chapter for me was maintaining therapeutic posture. In order to do that, the therapist must understand transference and try not to retaliate with countertransference rage. And during group therapy, treat everyone in the group equally. Being transparent and having some sort of self-disclosure can improve therapeutic relationship. Increasing the transparency of the therapist and also consensual validation can all help resolve transference distortions. This concludes my presentation on Chapter 7, Transference and Transparency. Thank you for watching and have a good day.